Hey everyone, today we're going to be looking at the spline editor in some detail. And the spline editor lives in Fusion, but in order to get the spline editor up and running, we have to have something to actually keyframe, to do some animations upon. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to start in the edit page. I have a fresh project here. We're going to go up to the effects library. We're going to come down here to effects. We're going to grab a Fusion composition, and we're going to drag that into our timeline. Now, Fusion composition is simply an empty sandbox where we can add a bunch of nodes and do whatever we want within Fusion. So we're going to be setting up a very basic animation, and the purpose of that animation is not going to be certainly to win any awards. It's going to be just to show off what the spline editor can do. So let's get right into it. So we've created our Fusion composition. It defaults to 5 seconds long. Currently our frame rate is 24 frames per second, the default frame rate on the new project. So 24 times 5 is going to give us 120 frames. So when we go into Fusion, we can see if we look on this bar here, which is counting all our frames for this particular Fusion element, we see this bar here is at 118, it's counting by 2, so this yellow bar over here represents 120. So I'm going to close down temporarily the spline editor. The spline editor is this window down here. I can turn that on and off by coming up here, and I click spline, off it goes. Right now we just have to set up a basic animation here. Okay, so we have a clean node editor. We only have this media out node, and everything that we add has to tie into that media out node, and that will represent what we actually see with our Fusion element. So right now we're just going to create a background. So I'm going to grab this background node from over here. I'm going to drag it in. I'm going to connect this up to our media out. We're going to take that background, and we're going to, from the color selector up here, we're going to take this pure red 255. Now what we want to do is add a mask on top of that. A simple rectangle mask will do for our purposes here. So I'm going to drag this mask down here, and I'm going to hook the rectangle up to this here. So this is called rectangle 1, background 1. So we see here that this rectangle mask, wherever that rectangle is defined, shows through to the red background. So right now this is centered at 0.5, 0.5. And the way the coordinate system in Fusion works, it's 0, 0 down here and 1, 1 up at the top right. So 0.5, 0.5 is right in the middle. So what we want to do with this is we want to take our width and our height, and we're going to set it to 0.1 and 0.1. So what 0.1 essentially represents is 10% of the width or the height of the screen. Now what we want to do is set up some simple keyframes here. So now I'm going to bring back the spline editor. I'm going to move this over here so we have a little bit of room. And what we're going to see is when we add keyframes, we're going to see stuff being added into this spline editor window over here. So what we want to do is just a very simple animation. I want to keyframe this at frame 0. We're going to keyframe its width. So over time, I'm going to have this bar just expand in width and then contract down to this size again. So what we want to do on frame 0 here, let's come down and click width. We're going to move up to 30 frames. And then we are going to change that value to 1, so the full width of the screen. And then up at 60, we're going to bring that back down to 0.1. So it's a very simple animation. I'll play it right now. Let's just go back to the start, and we play. There it goes. At 60 frames is back down to normal. And the second half of the frame, since this frame is or the second half of the animation, since this animation is 120 frames long, it's not doing anything. And that's okay. So what we see here is we see that this spline has been added to the spline editor. So just to make it fit, we're going to click on the zoom to fit. Okay, so now let's take a look at the spline editor and see what we actually created there. But first, let's look over here at the left. This here is the parameter section. So what we see here is we see the width parameter, which is the parameter that we're keyframing on. That width parameter is a child of rectangle 1. Rectangle 1 is over here. And we're sweeping the width. So this yellow in this case, this yellow spline here represents the keyframing and the sweeping of the width. So what we do is we single left click on this, and we're going to pick that same 255 red. Okay, so now let's take a look at what was actually generated here. So if you look on this top axis, this x-axis here, it's in terms of frames. So we see our 0th frame right here, and on the 0th frame, if we follow this down, we see this control point that was created here. That was when we had our frames over here set to 0 and we set our initial keyframe. This is what was created, and if you follow this value over to the y-axis, this here is the 0.1 that we had set up in our width control. So when we bring the playhead back to 0 and we follow this down here, we see 0.1 show up here. We look up at our width and we see 0.1 here. And as we move the playhead, keep an eye up here on this width value as it ramps up to 1, which is the full width of the screen. So there we go. We can see it changing over on the right, and we can see it changing up on screen as well. So that's what the two axes are. We have our frames up here, and we have the value of whatever parameter that we happen to be keyframing on. Now take a look at these little check marks here. When they're check marks like this, that means you can grab these control points and you can edit them and do whatever you want with them. If you click on this check mark, it turns into this circle here. That means the spline is still going to show up, but you can't control any of the control points. You click it another time, it just disappears altogether. So we're going to keep this on full edit mode for now. We're going to zoom to fit again. Now I want to start talking about all these features on the toolbar down here, but before we do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this bar and I'm going to change its color, essentially so we'll have two of these bars and we can change one of them and we can watch how they kind of behave relative to one another. So let's get that set up real quick. To do that, I'm going to double click on this. I'm going to detach the media out, and you notice nothing shows up here because nothing is attached to our media out. We're going to grab these two here. I'm going to Control C, Control V to make a duplicate. I'm going to change these names here because I didn't like the default naming convention that it chose. So F2 to do a rename, and I'm going to just rename it rectangle 2 and background 2. Now what I'm going to do with this background color here, instead of making it red, I'm going to change this to blue. So I come up to this color picker here, and we're going to pick this blue here, which is full 255 blue, 00 red for red and green. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this background here, and I'm going to display it on viewer 1. I'm going to take this background here, I'm going to display it on viewer 2. We're going to ignore the media out for a second. So I come down on background 1, I click on this viewer 1 node, and then I see our red one there, and I come up over here and we see our blue over here. So right now, once we merge these two together and pipe them to the media out node, they're going to be on top of each other. So I just want to change the position. So we're going to take this mask and I'm going to move this up slightly. So I'm going to take its Y value and I'm going to change that to 0.6, and I'm going to come to the blue and I'm going to change that to 0.4. Now I can take a merge node, which is right here, bring this merge node in, and I'm going to bring these two together, attach that to media out. Media out, it turns red now because it's not showing on any of the displays. I want to put that up on display 2. And now we see both of our bars together with our final media out node. So I'm also just going to switch up here to a single viewer. So if I go back to frame 0, I'm going to play this animation. When I did a copy, the rectangle number 1 had those keyframes attached to it. So when I did a copy and a paste, those keyframes were copied over as well. So both of these, when I push play, should do the animation. And sure enough, there they go. Okay, so now I'm going to take this bottom one, rectangle 2. I'm going to change this color here to blue, pure blue. Now take a look over here. Because they're fully overlapping, the spline shows up as purple. That's because you combine red and blue, you get purple. Once we start moving these nodes around, you'll see the individual colors of the individual spline once they're offset from each other. Okay, so now we're done our node editing. So I'm going to turn that off just to give us some more room. So I come up here, I click on nodes, and now we have our full bottom half of our screen dedicated to our spline editor. And again, I'm going to come over here, I'm going to click on zoom to fit, and there we go. And notice how this fits only up to the 60th frame because that's where our last keyframe resides, even though our Fusion animation goes all the way up to 120. So there's a couple controls up here which are for vertical and horizontal zooming. So I want to zoom out a little bit. There we go, and I can use the scroll bar down at the bottom here. So now I have my 0th frame starting here and 120 is up around here. So I'm just going to play that. And we have our loop set to on here, so it's just going to loop continuously. Just very quick, these yellow bars at the ends here, they're set to the 0th and the 120th frame right now. I can pull these in and it's effectively shorten my animation. So if I grab this one over here and I pull it into whatever 46, when it loops, it'll just start to this frame here. Same thing goes on with the other guy, but we want to do this full spread here, so we're just going to let it rip here. We have time 0 starting here. So you can ignore everything off to the back. One nice addition to the interface would have a slightly different color when you're outside of the frames that you're looking at, but in any case, here's our 0th frame here, so here's where we start. And what's happening right now is we're taking this width parameter and we're sweeping it straight up to number 1. So we're doing this transition in a very linear fashion. We're ramping right up to 1, and immediately when we hit 1, we're coming back down to 0. And so as I've talked about in my last videos, this is kind of like a car accelerating from 0 to full speed with no time for acceleration in between. It's not a very natural feel. It might be what you're going for, but if you're going for something that feels a little more organic, we're going to want to take this spline and we're going to want to curve it out a little bit. So one of the easiest ways we can do that is we can look at our toolbar down here. And the first thing I want to concentrate is these first 6 controls on the toolbar. Those are called control point interpolation controls. And they are going to interpolate or work in between of the control points, hence the name control point interpolation. So these here, again, in terms of terminology, are called control points. So the control point interpolation toolbar buttons are going to determine how this line behaves between each of these control points. So let's take a look at this very first one here called smooth. So what I'm going to do is I want to only work on our blue bar at the bottom, and I want to keep our red solid. So from what we learned before, we can click on this once here. That's going to effectively turn off the spline for rectangle 1. So we're only going to be working on the control points in rectangle 2. So I can do a select all here. I can do a box select like this, or I can alternatively come down to this button here, which is select all. That's going to grab all my 3 control points in this case. And I'm going to click the smooth button. So now first thing that we see is we see the individual colors of the individual splines. Still purple down here because they overlap, but here we see the red that hasn't changed. It's still doing this linear interpolation between the control points, but now we have this blue as a nice smooth curve here. And if you take a look at the animation, you can see the blue is moving a little more organically. There's some elasticity to it almost. So it has a bit of a more natural feel. So that's just the most simple thing that you can do to add a little bit of life to your to any animation. Now say that boxy sort of mechanical animation is what you're going for, similar to the red one. I can do a select all again, and I can click the second tool in the toolbar here, and that will set it back to linear. Now the 2 splines overlap each other. Okay, so now if we take a look at this invert button here. So this invert button, no matter what I do, doesn't actually seem to do anything. According to the manual, if I were to select these 2 nodes, for example, and I were to click invert, it would put this one up to the level of this guy here, and it would bring this one down to the level of this one here. No matter what combination of nodes I select or what mode they're in, it doesn't seem to ever enable. So either I'm using it wrong or there's a bug with it. If I am doing something wrong, please let me know in the comments below, and I'll put an edit in the description to rectify that. In any case, we can move on to these next 2 ones here. So these here are called step in and step out. If we want to kind of go away from these organic smooth curves we're talking about, we can kind of go to the extreme the other way and do essentially steps in between different nodes. So let's get that set up and see what that looks like. So I'll go back to linear mode just for a moment. What I'm going to do, I'm going to turn off rectangle 2. I'm going to enable rectangle 1, and I'm going to add a couple more nodes in here. So you can just click anywhere on one of the lines, and you can add a new node. A new control point, sorry. So I'll add one there, I'll add one at frame 10, and then I'll add one at frame 40, and I'll add one at frame 50. Now what I can do there is when I select all these nodes, I'm going to select step in. So what step in does is it goes in towards the next node, and then when it hits the next node on the timeline, it jumps up to that value, and so on, and so on, and so on, and gives you the staircase effect. So I'm just going to, for the moment, I'm going to turn that one off. I'm going to turn on rectangle 2. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to add nodes at those key points. Then I'm going to select all those, and instead of a step in, I'm going to do a step out. Now I'll show the 2 together, and you'll see how they differ a little bit. So with step in, we go over horizontally to the next node, then we jump up to it. Whereas with step out, we make the jump first, then we traverse horizontally, and so on and so on and so on. So I'll play these 2 together so we can see how they look. So again, the red is step in. That's this one here. And the blue is step out. So here we go. Let's move it back to the start. So again, using this, it's a very digital, discrete nature that you see here. So that could be something that you're going for. And that's where these will come in useful. Okay, so I've kind of reset things a little bit. I've gone back, I've taken rectangle 1, which is our red spline here, and I set it back up to linear interpolation between all the control points. And I have rectangle 2 set up with just the default click of this smooth function here. So what I'm going to do is I just want to focus on the blue spline right now, so rectangle 2. So we can do that a couple ways. We can turn off rectangle 1 in our parameter tree here, or we can also come over to these ellipses here. I can click on that and I can select show only selected tool. And so nothing shows up right now because I have nothing selected, but as soon as I select rectangle 2, which is what I want to work on, that's what's going to show up over here. So I can hold my mouse wheel down, my middle mouse button, and then I can drag anywhere here. And again, I can scale with these two controls up here, and I can scroll with a slider down here, or this one over here. One of the things we haven't talked about yet, when we select one of these control points, you see these Bezier handles. That's what these guys are called over here. And what that does is when you grab these Bezier handles, is it really allows you to shape your spline in whichever way you want. So if I want to skew this over to the left here, I can pull things this way. Now you notice when I move one, that the other one kind of rocks along with it like a teeter-totter. I can control select either one of these if I want to sort of break that symmetry, and then I can and I can move these independently. So let me just go back to the default smooth here. Okay, that looks good. So let's just go through a very quick example of how I would use these Bezier handles to change my animation. So let's say I wanted the blue box to expand really quickly and slowly come back down to its original size. So first I could maybe just grab this control point. I can skew it over a little bit to the left. I can take this Bezier handle and I can kind of pull things out this way here. And what I don't like down here maybe is that this is a little bit too abrupt, so I can select this one which has its own handle and I can pull this out a little bit. So what this is going to do, it's going to do a very slow start, and during this quick transition here it's going to snap up almost to its full size and then slowly come to its full width as we reach our maximum here, and then it's going to do almost this linear slide back down. So let's take a look at how that looks. We'll go back to frame 0 and we're going to play. So you can see, there we go, we get that very quick transition here and a much slower transition as we come back. Let's say I want to reverse that. I want to have a slow entrance and a quick exit. And I can come down to the 6th tool on the toolbar, which is reverse, and that will just flip things around. So now, as we come back the playhead, we can see that expand slowly and quickly come back during that transition there. So we know that our Fusion animation is 120 frames. We're only really using 60. So we go up to 60 frames as we come over here, and then for 60 to 120, it's not really doing anything. Let's say I wanted to copy this over and make a duplicate over here, but I didn't want to set up new splines and do the same edits and all that type of stuff. I can use what are called the spline loop modes. There's 3 buttons on the toolbar that will control these modes. So let's go through those one by one. So I can select all my nodes here, and the first one I'm going to look at here is the set loop. And when I click that, it's going to duplicate essentially what I have, and it's going to go on and on and on and on for all eternity. Really our clip ends at 120, but visually this repeats sort of forever. Now the beauty here is any edits I do on the original get applied to the copies as well. So that's a pretty handy tool. This next one here is what's called, gotta select all my nodes, is called set ping pong. And ping pong is going to take a mirrored copy as its first copy, then it's going to flip it again and again and again. So it's going to ping pong back and forth between this original orientation, a mirrored version of it, and so on and so on and so on. So the last tool we want to take a look at here is the set relative. Now what I've done right now is I've kind of gone and I've set things back to our initial state. We're just using this smooth control here to get this. I put on the set loop mode, and you can see what we get here is this pattern repeats. I'm going to put the playhead where our spline ends and the copies begin. So right here. So if I grab this node here and I move it up, well, you can see what happens. We're going to take an exact copy of that, and you're going to see this big discontinuity as we jump down towards the starting point over here, and we repeat and we repeat and we repeat. The difference between that and set relative is, I'm going to undo that. So now I'm back into normal mode. I'm going to click set relative. I click on that and you'll notice nothing really changed until I grab this node here and move it up. And as I move this node up, take a look what happens to all these humps over here. We see them all kind of scale up. So what's happening is it's still repeating the pattern, but I've set my starting point relative to where my last control point was located. So this is a good tool to use if you have some trend that you want to establish and have that trend sort of repeat where you grow and shrink something consecutively over a number of iterations. Okay, I will undo that, bring that back down to 0. I'm going to grab these nodes here and I'm going to just take off that repeating mode. And I want to just show a couple extra of these controls here. So the first one here is this click append. So right now, if I click anywhere outside of a spline, nothing really happens. If I click on a spline, I'll create a new control point. But in click append mode, wherever you click, a node is going to be created exactly at that point. So up here, I would click, and I'm still holding, so I can drag and manipulate a little bit. Down here, I could click, and we get another node created there. So it's just a different way we can enter different control points. So I'm going to come out of that mode here. We go over to this next control here, and this is our time stretch. And that really does what you'd think. So I can grab a bunch of nodes here. I can come into time stretch mode. Now I have to move my playhead because it's covering this white bar here. So these two white bars signify the start and the end of the control points that we've selected, and I can grab either one of those and I can just stretch it over time. Shape box, this is a pretty cool one. I can click on this. I can select a bunch of nodes. It'll create this box around it with all these handles on it, and I can just skew that box however I want. And as I skew that box, it's going to affect the control points inside that box. So for any 3D modelers out there, this would kind of be akin to having a face sort of set up and you wanted to grab that whole face and sort of squash it a little bit to give it a bit of a different look. You have most things set up how you want, but you want to do these squishes or pushes or pulls to kind of fine tune things. So pretty cool. And finally, we have this control here. I'm going to go out of this box mode. We have this control here, and all this will show key markers. All this does is wherever there's a control point, it'll show these keyframe markers up top here. So it just gives you a little extra visual indication. All right, so the final thing I want to look at is these controls down here. So when I select a node, it's going to show me my current time, which is my 30th frame. It's also going to show what value it is, which is 1. So for either of these, I can just put in what I want. So if I want to change that to 0.5, okay, there we go, done. I'm going to do an undo, and same thing with the time. If I want to move this up to from frame 30 to 35, for example, I would just put 35 in here, and off we go. Let me just undo that again. There's also a drop-down menu here. So time, you can take a time offset. So if I wanted to go to 35 from here, instead of entering 35, I would just enter, oops, let me reselect this again. I would select time offset, and I would select 5 frames. So that would be positive 5 frames in this direction. I can enter negative numbers as well. So I put -5, that's going to snap me back to frame 30. So there's also this time scale option. I don't fully understand this. I'm going to skip over this one here. When it comes to value though, value is pretty straightforward. Offset, we can do the same thing. So I want to take this down to 0.8. So my offset from 1 would be -0.2. Then I'm down to 0.8. I also have this scale factor here. So if I wanted to take that 0.8 and go down to 0.4, that would be half the value. So a scaling factor of 0.5. That brings me down to 0.4. All right, well, we've covered pretty much everything I wanted to cover as far as the spline editor is concerned. Thanks a lot for checking this out, and take care. We'll see you all soon.